Okay, here comes everybody.
Thanks, Justin. Okay, welcome back from the break, everybody. For our next offering today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Terry Daniels for a talk on the stubborn persistence of grief stage theories. Terry is an interfaith hospice chaplain, end-of-life educator and grief counselor certified in death, dying, and bereavement by the Association of Death Education and Counseling, and in trauma support by the International Association of Trauma Professionals. She conducts workshops throughout the US and teaches at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. She's the founder of the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief, as well as the Ask Dr. Death podcast. She's also the author of 4 books on death, grief, and the afterlife. Over the years, Terry has helped hundreds of people learn to live, die, and grieve more consciously. Her work is acclaimed by hospice professionals, spiritual seekers, therapists, theologians, and academics worldwide. Terry is open for relevant questions throughout her talk, so please post your questions in the Zoom chat. She gave a wonderful presentation for us last year, which was especially helpful for my family and me in the wake of tragically losing my younger brother at the age of 38, and for which we are still grateful. So Terry, I'm really looking forward to your talk today. I'm so happy to welcome you back. And please enlighten us on the stages of grief, so called.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you. And thank you to Tibet House and Menla for having me back a second year in a row. I'm just so flattered and honored and grateful. So thank you all. Thank you all for who are listening. My talk today is about the processes of grieving and mourning, and I'm going to start with a little introduction that I put together specifically for this group to kind of create a bridge between the deeply metaphysical content we've been hearing all weekend and the more academic psychological angle from which I'm going to approach this topic. So I'm trying to create a little bridge for that. Now that we've come to Sunday, the last day of this conference, with the theme for today being after-death practices, I'm going to bring us back to the material world a little bit. We've been talking a lot about various cosmologies, the journey of the soul in the death and the after-death process, the beauty of numinous reality. But I'm going to bring us back to Earth here to talk about what happens to the people who are left here on Earth to grieve for us after we depart the earth plane. Because we are here on earth, because we're incarnate, despite how spiritual we might be, the fact is that we do identify with the material dimension and all our various attachments, which means that when somebody we love dies, we're sad, we miss them, we feel pain. The whole animal kingdom does this, as far as we know. There have been a lot of studies on animals grieving. We don't know if a salmon grieves, but we're working on finding out. And so regardless of how much knowingness we have about the nature of impermanence and non-attachment, we are still human beings who live in an ego body, and we grieve when something we love goes away or when we perceive it as being gone. And we may completely understand the idea of a soul's intention for leaving the body, when it leaves the body, how it leaves the body, but that understanding exists really in the spiritual realm. And that's great, that's fine and beautiful, but we still have to contend with the emotional dimension. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, about our grief. And this talk is going to be a little on the academic side and is particularly directed to those of you who work with grief. If you're a counselor or a hospice worker or a therapist or a spiritual healer of some kind, or just basically a human being who wants to be present for other human beings when they are suffering and grieving. So as Michael said, I'm a hospice chaplain. I'm also a death educator. I teach in the thanatology programs at a couple of different universities, and I train chaplains and hospice staff in various aspects of dying and grieving. And as a chaplain, when I'm sitting with a dying person, it is the most pristine, elevated spiritual space you could possibly share with another human being. It doesn't get more intimate than that, in my opinion. And sometimes I will synchronize my breathing with them and travel with them, which, in a shared death experience, what William Peters calls a shared death experience. Sometimes I'll sit with them and I'll very quietly to myself sing the Heart Sutra or the Gayatri Mantra, or sometimes I'll even do the shamanic Great Death Spiral. I have a lot of multicultural tools in my toolkit that I use with dying people, and I'm very much in the metaphysical realm when I'm doing that. But then they die, and the next thing I know, I'm with the family and they are crying and they are grieving and they are suffering. And it might be the next hour or the next day or week or month. And they're missing the physical presence of this person who's no longer in their life. And to take care of them, I now have to move into the realm of material attachment and basic emotional needs of human life. So that's my little bridge, my little intro. And when as a chaplain, if any of you are chaplains, you know that we keep our spiritual perspectives out of the conversation. We walk into that room with that family or patient with no religion, no beliefs. We are just a blank piece of paper, and we meet them where they are. So when I have somebody who's grieving and who's in a lot of pain, I'm not going to talk to them about the soul's intention or mystical union with the divine or returning to the light or any of that. I might get there months down the road if I end up in a therapeutic relationship with them, but not in that acute moment. In that acute moment, I'm just looking at raw grief. And so when we talk about grief, here's my next little bridge. Every one of you has heard of the 5 stages of grief, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to teach it to you. I am going to try to unteach it to you. And I'm going to just jump right into this. I have a lot of documents and resources and research papers and things that I can send to you. I will type my email address into the chat box in a little bit, and you can contact me if you want to see any of the research papers and documents about all of this. So by now, here we are in 2023. Most bereavement professionals know that the 5 stages of grief is not considered a viable approach to counseling or grief support. It's not considered a viable theory. And to quote one of the top grief research teams in the world today, Strobe and Shute, I'm going to just give you a little quote of something they wrote in their research, that the 5 stages should be, quote, discarded by all concerned, including bereaved persons themselves. At best, it should be relegated to the realms of history. I'm going to give you a quintessential sort of bullet point summary of the main reasons why we don't use the 5 stages of grief. And this also comes from an important researcher, Kastenbaum, in 2015. Number 1, the existence of these stages as such has not been demonstrated. Number 2, no evidence has been presented that people actually do move from stage 1 through stage 5. 3, the limitations of the method have not been acknowledged. 4, the line is blurred between description and prescription. 5, the totality of the person's life is neglected in favor of the supposed stages. And number 6, the resources, pressures, and characteristics of the immediate environment, which can make a tremendous difference, are not taken into account. I could go on and on with all the reasons why we don't use this, but those are sort of the key things. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of history. And again, feel free to ask a question anytime you want. Type it in the chat box, and Michael, you can interrupt me with that. So I'm not going to go all the way back to the origins of grief theory with Freud. That goes back quite a way, but let's start with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. So in 1969, she wrote her book on death and dying, which of course became a huge bestseller. And it was based on interviews that she did with about 200 patients in a hospital who had a terminal diagnosis, who were dying. And she interviewed them about, how do you feel about your death, about facing your death? And she gathered all their responses. And from those responses, she synthesized it down to what she found to be the 5 most common responses. Now, keep that word responses in your mind, because we're going to keep coming back to that. And those 5 most common responses, most commonly experienced by dying people that she interviewed, were the 5 things that we all know: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Now, her study was not an academic study. It was not a peer-reviewed, academic study. It was a anecdotal study based on interviews. So right there, it's not really scientific. And I am not dissing Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. Her work made it possible for us to be having this conversation right now. None of what happened to her theory was her fault. I'm just going to say that right now. It happened because her work was misunderstood, misrepresented, misappropriated, and exploited. And I'll get to that here in a minute. So here comes this book. It's very hugely famous, and that's 1969, 1970. And many years later, in the early 90s, along comes a guy by the name of David Kessler. You may know his name. And he meets her at a conference, and he says to her, how about we collaborate on another book together called The 5 Stages of Grief? And we move it away from the stages of facing your death and apply it to the stages of grief. And the two of them collaborated on a book that came out in 1995 called The 5 Stages of Grief. And David Kessler was very well connected and had a very good system of promotion. And that book became massive bestseller. And that's how it got known as The 5 Stages of Grief. And when that happened, all the people who were actual grief researchers, psychologists, academics, scientists, psychiatrists, all the people who actually work in the field of grief, started to analyze his book and this idea of the 5 stages, and quickly came up with all these reasons why it wasn't viable. And so that was all over the news. And Kessler and Elisabeth Kubler-Ross were confronted about this a lot. And they actually said things like, yeah, we know it's not really viable, but it's so embedded in the culture now that why try to change it now? Which is not a real ethical attitude. And so moving forward, and then I'll get off of this David Kessler rant for a minute, moving way forward until just this last year, long after Elisabeth was gone, David Kessler came out with a new book called Meaning Making, the 6th Stage of Grief. So not only did he stick to the 5-stage theory, but he now has added a 6th one with the permission of the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. And he's now teaching this and certifying people as grief experts using this teaching. So, okay. So that's just to give you an idea how this happened. So the 5 stages of grief has been so popularized and so misappropriated that it's just everywhere in the world. And I'm going to give you some funny little examples of where you can find it. It's everywhere, as I'm sure you know. So in a 2017 study on how employees adapt to changes in the workplace, tracks their responses to how they feel about the changes, like, new hours and different hours for lunch breaks and whatever they were doing, along the stages of grief from denial to acceptance about changes in the workplace. In the practice of law, a study about how 3D printing might pose a threat to patents for inventors, they used the 5 stages to show how the inventors cope with this new technology, supposedly threatening their inventions. It's used in addiction recovery to show how the process of attachment adaptation happens when you're relinquishing the thing that you're addicted to. They lay the 5 stages on top of that. In medical school, it's been used to track how residents deal with long hours and no sleep, and they respond to that using the 5 stages of grief. And finally, in art and design, one researcher laments that the stages have not been depicted adequately in art and proposes that we need more visual art that outlines all the stages in the grieving process. So it's everywhere. I don't need to tell you this because you all know this. So what am I going to do with this? I wrote a paper about this that was published in the Omega Journal of Death and Dying, and it was very well received. And this is really important. But what's the point of me complaining about this if I'm not going to offer an alternative? So here is what I'm offering, and here is what I hope that we can all use in our grieving. So I'm going to give you some alternatives of how we can relate to grief and different language. In fact, I'm going to ask you to type into the chat box, think about your own losses and your own grief and some other words that you can come up with that characterize your response other than denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Go ahead and just put that in the chat box, something that you might have experienced with your own grief. Sadness, love, yearning, connection, okay, longing, exaltation, equanimity, thank you, I love that, regret, gratitude, devastation, exactly, relief, and then guilt for feeling relief, right? All right, keep those coming, those are wonderful. I'm going to go over here and look for something else. And so, yes, to everything that you're saying, those are responses to loss. Remember that word response. You know, these are not stages. These are responses that human beings have. And, you know, if somebody said that these were stages, first there's emptiness, then there's regret, then there's uncontrolled tears, then there's forgiveness, that would not sit right with you. So what we want to start doing is looking at grief in terms of responses and not stages. Just simply replace the word stage with response. So I'm going to throw out some words here that are different ways we can, and this is just a few out of endless possible responses. Isolation, regression, stoicism, distancing, guilt, regret, shame, blame, resentment, obsession, perseveration, fear, anxiety, dread, equanimity, right here on my list, and somebody said that, curiosity, gratitude, optimism. Instead of isolation, maybe an increase in social engagement. You reach out to different communities and different social groups. Now you're a widow, your husband died, you're going to make new friends with other widows. Your social structure is going to change. Finding new strengths in yourself. Perhaps the death of the person is freedom from an oppressive relationship that you needed to be freed from. Our spiritual awareness changes. We can move into accepting and understanding impermanence. Imagine that. And spiritual expansion, or in cases of toxic theology, it could also be spiritual contraction, or it could be expansion by rejecting toxic religious beliefs. So all of these things are possible responses. I love time becomes more relevant, disassociation. These are great things. And so these are the things that we want to look for. And when you're looking at your own grief or trying to help another person with their grief, and you're limiting yourself to this little box of 5 responses, you're going to miss all these other ones. And not only are you going to miss the other ones, but if you see somebody feeling relief or exultation or curiosity or excitement about, the person's not in pain anymore. They're in the next dimension. This is really great. Somebody might think that you're having a pathological grief response because you're not supposed to be happy. You're not supposed to be excited. You're not supposed to be curious. You're supposed to be depressed and angry and bargaining. So you can see why these stages have limited the space in which we can do our grief work or help other people do theirs. So another angle on this that is also really important is there is an expectation in our death-phobic society that grief should always include intense distress. And the 5 stages sort of lean in favor of distress. There's no positive emotions except perhaps acceptance. But acceptance in that framework is kind of like resignation, like, oh, okay, I guess I have to accept that he died. There's nothing hopeful. There's nothing growth-oriented. There's no post-traumatic growth. There's just this distress. And there's been a lot of studies on, is intense distress necessary? Now, I'm going to break this into 2 sections, which is expected anticipated death, like your 95-year-old grandmother. And then, of course, there's traumatic death, like a 5-year-old child gets shot in the classroom. So let's put that one aside. We'll come back to that. We're just going to talk about the grandmother kind of death. And what we know from really good bona fide research that's been done is the natural default place that most people fall into with loss is acceptance. And this extreme distress, depression, anger, staying in bed with the covers over your head for a month and crying every day and wanting to die and all of this is the exception, not the rule. And the reason that this became kind of, I guess I'll say, popular is because, one, we see this is what we see in movies, right? We see the extreme distress reaction to grief, but also the information that researchers have on grief comes from people who have participated in clinical studies or people that have come to the attention of clinicians because they've gone to a grief counselor or a grief therapist, and their responses, their case studies get built into the body of knowledge. And so information about how adults cope with loss comes from people who have sought help, who have sought treatment because they had high levels of distress. So the information we have is kind of skewed in that direction, because if you're having a resilient response, you're not going to go to a therapist. You're not going to sign up for a study about grief responses. And so those responses are not recorded as frequently. And so therefore they're considered outside of the norm. To go straight to acceptance is considered outside of the norm. So what we have is the possibility of resiliency. And there are certain innate qualities that people have that can make them more or less resilient when it comes to loss. And some of those qualities can be identified. For example, if you are a person who is able to make decisions and take action kind of quickly when something happens, you are going to be more resilient to a loss of any kind, a sudden loss. By contrast, if you're a person who has a really hard time being proactive, looking at a situation, deciding what needs to be done, and then doing it, if that's really problematic for you, your resiliency is going to be a little bit lower. Skill in communication is a really big factor in this. If you can articulate your feelings and your needs, if you can reach out to people around you and ask for help or talk about your feelings or express whatever you need to express and verbalize and connect and communicate, you're doing much better with resilience than if you're a person who cannot articulate your feelings or will not, for whatever reason, cultural inhibitions, family history with communication. There's a lot of reasons why you might be more closed up that way. That's going to make your resilience more difficult too. And in terms of cultural influences, there's cultural influences and religious beliefs that have a powerful impact on how we respond to loss. Somebody asked Matthew Fox earlier, how do you help somebody who's dying and is afraid of going to hell? And that's a really big question. I do have to do that all the time in my work. And you really can see how these cultural and religious beliefs can influence pretty much everything. Even if we think we're done with that religious belief, when it comes to death and loss and grief, it comes right up to the surface. And so that can influence our resilience. If you were indoctrinated in what is actually commonly known as proper Christian grief, which means that you don't grieve because you know your loved one is with Jesus in heaven, so you should be happy, you're going to feel really conflicted when you have a loss, and you're not going to express yourself, and you're not going to take certain actions. And that's also going to complicate your grief process. I want to go back here for a minute. So what do we have instead of Kubler-Ross's stages? So in the years following the success of her stage theory, all these researchers came together and developed new ideas. And instead of stages now, we have a bunch of different kinds of theories. We have the theory of continuing bonds, the dual process model, the tasks of grieving. And so let's look just briefly at tasks. Somebody by the name of William Worden came up with these 4 tasks. Tasks are something you do, just like you have to wash the dishes and take out the trash and walk the dog. Tasks. So the tasks of grieving are, number 1, to accept the reality of the loss. Number 2, to process the pain of grief. Number 3, to adjust to the new world without the deceased or the lost object. I call it the lost object because it's not always about somebody dying. Sometimes it's somebody leaving you, a divorce. Sometimes it's the loss of your job or the loss of your health or the loss of your financial stability. And then finally, to find an enduring connection with the departed person while embarking on the new life. So these are the 4 tasks. This is a model that's very workable. I'm going to put them in the chat room here so you can look at them again. Hold on just a minute. There we go. And so, that pretty much covers everything. And you can see how the stages don't even take these things into consideration. Adjusting to the new world, finding an enduring connection. And enduring connections, let me go on that for a minute, because that fits so well with what we're talking about this weekend, is this theory is called the continuing bonds theory. So way back a long time ago in 1917, Sigmund Freud wrote a paper called Mourning and Melancholia. And in it, he said that the way we should process grief and loss is to emote heavily, to feel our pain, to look at the old pictures and reminisce and remember, with the ultimate goal being to separate and split off from that lost object and to seal over and heal the pain like a scab over it and get over it and be done and move on and end the relationship. And that was the model for a really long time, up into the 60s. And in the 60s, it all changed in psychology. And you guys are going to love the reason, all my Tibetan Buddhist friends listening, why this happened. When China invaded Tibet in 1950, all the monks left. The monasteries were burned and the books, and the monks had to leave, and they fled, and they went into exile, and they went to India, and they went other places, and eventually they trickled into Europe and eventually into the US. And they brought their teachings with them. Now, Buddhism was always known in the West, but not like it was in the 60s. It experienced this big boom of popularity. And for those of you who are old enough to remember beatniks and hippies, we embraced that. And so it really changed our culture, and it seeped into psychology. So the researchers, the grief researchers and the psychologists were starting to fold Buddhist cosmologies into their theories, and the idea that the soul continues on. And so the grief psychology theories began to change, and we came up with something called continuing bonds, which threw the Freudian theory on its head and said, no, wait a minute, you don't have to disconnect from the person who has died. You can still be connected with them. You can talk to them. You can keep them alive in your life. They are still present somewhere in the universe. They have not been erased from existence. And fast forward a couple more decades, now we have the internet, and information about other cultures and other belief systems is available to us at our fingertips. And we can see how other cultures deal with continuing bonds. For example, in China, a family will have an ancestor altar in their house, and everyone who's ever died, there's a picture of them. There's like, they put coins and flowers and little objects, and they have a grief altar and an ancestor altar in their house. We learned this from them. Ancestor altars are really, present in Africa, in Latin countries, everywhere. We didn't really know this too much before the internet. So now it's all there for us. And so we have these new approaches of like, oh yeah, we don't have to get over the relationship. We have to understand that the relationship has a new form. This person is not physically sitting next to me in my house anymore, but they're still in the universe, and I can still connect with them through all kinds of wonderful processes, including the ancestor altar, and also therapeutic processes like guided after-death communication, art therapy, chair therapy, where you imagine you're talking to the person in a chair sitting next to you. There's all kinds of stuff. So this is where it's going now, and this is so different than where we were with the 5 stages. And a couple other models I want to show you. There's another researcher by the name of Therese Rando, who's similar to Worden and his tasks of grieving. She came up with the 6 R's, letter R, 6 R's of grieving. And those are: recognize the loss, react to the separation, recollect and remember, relinquish old attachments, readjust, and reinvest. So these are processes of recovery. We're building toward recovery, and we don't use the word recovery, actually. We use the word reconstruct or rebuild. I can't think of the word I'm thinking of right now, but it will come back to me. So it's all about, notice they all start with recognize the loss. Recognize the loss could be the same as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's acceptance, which is at the end of her spectrum, the last step. Here we have it at the beginning. Acceptance is where you start. And recognize the loss, for people who've had somebody die. Okay, I'll put those in the chat. Thank you. If you've had somebody who is like missing in action in a war and you never can see their body, or a child who was kidnapped, something like that, you're going to have a hard time with that task of recognizing the loss. Reacting to the separation means that you feel your pain, you react to it, you scream and cry, you talk, you have a funeral, you do all the things that you do in reaction to the separation. Some people don't do that. I have seen people who are so traumatized by the death that they don't want to have a funeral or any ritual or any kind of memorial service at all. And, this is not necessarily always a good idea, because you need to have that process to help you recognize and to help you react. Recollect and remember. This is also, Freud actually had this one, right? To spend time talking about the person. So I tell my clients, like if it's Christmas or Thanksgiving and they have had a close family member die recently, I tell them to put a seat at the table for Thanksgiving dinner with the person. I show them how to make a centerpiece for the Thanksgiving table or the Christmas dinner or whatever, and put a picture of the person in the flowers in the centerpiece. Bring them in. And around the Thanksgiving table, everybody goes around and tells a little story about that person. That's recollect and remember. In some families, many families, they won't do this. It's too painful. They won't even talk about the person. Also, in some cultures, you're actually not even supposed to say the name of the dead person. But I'm just keeping this focused on, the Western Judeo-Christian American culture where we live, because that's a topic for a whole other story. Relinquish old attachments. So that means, the things that we used to do. Well, he always liked it, when I had yellow roses in the house. You don't have to give up that attachment. That is a way of honoring him. But it's things like, I had a woman in a group the other day whose son died 5 years ago from suicide. Very tragic, very difficult to process. But she has not moved anything in his room. He was like 19. He lived at home with her. And the other 2 adult children also live at home. And she has not changed his bedroom from the day he died, 5 years. She hasn't taken his clothes out of the closet or done anything. And her other adult children who live with her are not comfortable with this. They keep telling her, you've got to move on, you've got to do this. And she just refuses to do it because she says, because that'll make it really real. Well, it's been really real for 5 years. And holding on like that is where grief does come into what we call complicated grief or prolonged mourning disorder. That is pathological. And I would guarantee that this woman is having physical symptoms, illnesses manifested in her body because of the way that she's holding and carrying this and not allowing the energy to move. So that's what relinquishing old attachments is. Readjust, obviously, you change that room and you make it into a sewing room. You take his clothes and you take them to Goodwill, or you give them away to friends. There's all these beautiful things that you can do using the clothes as an example to keep continuing bonds. I came up with this idea just recently. A woman wanted to give away her husband's shoes. He had lots of shoes and she was taking the clothes to Goodwill. And I came up with this idea to write his name with a marker on the insole of the shoe or on the bottom of the shoe. And then everyone who's wearing the shoes, who buys them at Goodwill, has his name being walking around wherever they're going, walking with them. Eventually the name will fade away. But there's all these just beautiful things you can do. So that's continuing bonds. And then finally, the last one is reinvest in your new life. What is your new life going to look like? What do you want it to look like 6 months from now or 6 years from now? And that can mean selling the house, buying another house, decorating it the way you wanted it. If you were a couple, now it's just your house, or maybe moving to another location, changing jobs, changing your name. Take your emotional energy and reinvest it into something else and build that something else. What I did when my son died 16 years ago is I decided to go to college for the first time. I never went when I was young. And here I am now with a doctorate and doing this work. I reinvested my energy into something new. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that. You don't have to go get a degree. You don't have to start a foundation. But you can create something new in your life, and that can be anything that fits for you. And so finally, another one of the new theories that I want to talk about quickly, just give me 1 second to move over here and look at something. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. I veered off. So another new model that we love is called the dual process model, loss and restoration orientation. I'm going to put this in the chat room. And this one is something that you could all do anytime you want. It's super easy. Basically, the idea is, and this really works with energy work. So the idea is that when you experience a loss of any kind, your emotions oscillate between loss orientation and restoration orientation. That was the word I was looking for, restoration. I said reconstruction. I'm going to draw a little picture for you here. Hold on, and show you what I mean. All right, I'm just going to hold this up to the camera. Let me get back on my Zoom thing here. Anyway, I don't know if you can see this. There we go. It's a little chart with just a piece of paper with a line down the middle. Loss on one side, restoration on the other. And the idea with this is that you track your emotional responses as you go through the day and the week and the month. So loss orientation is what you're doing when you can't get out of bed in the morning. All you're doing is just crying all day. You're angry. You pick a fight with your spouse. You're just mean and bitchy to everybody, and you're not taking care of yourself. You're not eating properly, or you're drinking too much, or you start doing drugs or smoking cigarettes or doing something that's not healthy for you. That's all loss orientation. You're angry at God. You're angry at the medical establishment. All of this is fine stuff. This is absolutely normal for you to be going through this, but you want to identify it on that loss half of the chart. Restoration orientation is not that. Restoration orientation is you get out of bed and you say, all right, today's the day I'm going to clean out the closet and get rid of his clothes. And you think, I think I'll call my 3 best friends to come over, and we'll get some champagne and we'll make a party out of it. And we'll drink champagne and we'll tell stories about him, and we'll take his clothes out and we'll say, hey, let's give this one to Fred and let's give this coat to Mary. And we're going to do this process with the support of our friends. And that's restoration orientation. Or a friend comes over and says, hey, get out of bed, let's go for a hike. And it's a beautiful day and you're hiking and you're with your dog. And for a minute or an hour, you actually feel good and you're laughing. And then you go, oh, damn, I just felt good for a minute. That was weird. I wasn't expecting that. And then you immediately feel guilty for feeling good, right? But that little moment of feeling good, you are in restoration orientation. So the idea is you make this little chart and you track yourself every day, and you actually write what you were doing on each side of those different orientations. The reason this works, the reason this is important, is because it keeps energy moving. And so many of you listening right now are energy workers, light workers, healers. You just want that energy to keep bouncing back and forth. And as long as it's doing that, you're healthy and you're going through a healthy grief process. There is such thing as a healthy versus unhealthy grief process. I'll get to that in a minute if we have time. Use that little chart if you can. It's very healthy and it'll really help you a lot. So I see there's some stuff in the chat box. Michael, if there's anything there you want to funnel over to me.
So I would like to reiterate that it's helpful for people to keep the questions brief and not have many compound questions. We had Victoria asking how you had referred to toxic religious beliefs in the beginning.
Yeah.
And she had asked for a description or an explanation of what you mean by that.
Well, that would be a whole other presentation, but to sum it up in simple, quick terms, the belief that there's hell, that if somebody, let's say your teenage son died from suicide, like this woman I mentioned, and I don't know if she believes in hell or not, but if she believes that suicides go to hell, she thinks her 19-year-old son is burning in flames forever. That is definitely going to complicate her grief process, because not only does she have to deal with her pain and all these steps and these tasks and these processes, she also has this big baggage of bad theology that's just swarming over her like this big darkness that she also has to deal with. And in that process, she may have, hopefully, will have a crisis of faith where she starts questioning her beliefs. And when that happens, she can do one of two things. She can stay in the toxic belief system that says there is a hell, and for the rest of her life, she's going to think her son's in hell, and she's never going to see him again in the afterlife because she's going to heaven. So she can stay there, or she can allow her beliefs to change and start questioning and reach out to explore other theologies. And I have a resource list. Give me 1 second to type my email address in here. Give me 1 second, because I can't type and talk at the same time. This is my email address if you want to copy and paste that somewhere. And if you want me to send you this page of all kinds of resources, articles on toxic theology, articles on all of this, videos, audio, all of that, I can send that to you to answer a lot of these questions.
Okay, and then some of these are actually just are comments, and Tsumoy is sharing that she works with a lot of people who don't have words, so to speak, and have much more efficaciousness in communicating through art in terms of dealing with grief. So that's an interesting comment for sure. And Victoria also was asking if some people don't grieve according to your construct of the 6 R's or the 4 tasks. Is it fair to judge them? And I guess that means to say, I'm going to reinterpret this. Does that apply to everyone, or is this is a working model that can be helpful to more people than the so-called 5 stages?
Nothing applies to everyone. And these are not my models. These are models of, the grief researchers who put them together. But I would say that the Warden's 4 tasks and Rando's 6 R's are pretty universal. They're not prescribing how you should feel.
Mm-hmm.
They're prescribing what happens. And so, nobody's judging. I don't know where the idea of judging is coming from, but I would say that if somebody has not recognized the loss, has not, faced the reality of the loss, that as a clinician, I am going to assess that is a step that they need to do. I mean, we're talking about grief counseling and clinical work here. So, do we call it judgment when a doctor diagnoses you with something, and we do have diagnoses. There is something, and I actually wanted to get to this, called complicated grief or prolonged mourning disorder. Michael, would you type that into
Sure.
the chat box? Prolonged mourning disorder. And I'm sorry, Victoria, but it is true. There is such thing as pathological grief. And if you look up prolonged mourning disorder, you'll find it. And what that is if, let's say, the 95-year-old grandmother or parent dies who's been sick for a long time in a nursing home with dementia, bedbound, in diapers, nonverbal, and almost 100% non-responsive, she finally dies. And you are devastated and unable to move her clothes out of the closet and crying for days and weeks, and 6 months later, you're still in that state. That is not a healthy grief trajectory. There is something called a healthy grief trajectory and a not healthy grief trajectory. Now, if that death was something tragic and traumatic, like your 5-year-old child got hit by a car, 6 months from now and a year from now, of course you're still crying every day. And maybe you haven't taken the clothes out of the closet. But 5 years from now, it is expected that you should be on a trajectory of restoration by that point. If you're not, you can be diagnosed with prolonged mourning disorder, in which case you would be referred to a grief therapist. I'm not a grief therapist. I'm a counselor. They're 2 different things. And, in some cases, you might be on medication, and you would need an intensive intervention. By far, most people don't need that. And it's because if you have the tools for coping with this loss, you won't get to that point of prolonged mourning disorder. And the tools are the resilience factors that I talked about earlier. And also, you know what the number 1 biggest and best tool is? I am going to ask you to type that in there if anybody wants to venture a guess. If you had to just pick one resource that can help people cope from grief, what would it be? I'm just waiting to see if anybody types anything in. Very good. Healing presence of others, compassioning others, Community. Thank you. You hit it on the head. That's exactly it. Friends and family support, community support. That is the number one foundational thing. If you don't have that, you're going to have a much harder time finding your way to restoration and resilience. And you may be a person who is not very outgoing. You may be very introverted. You don't have a lot of friends. And, I've seen people, among my clients who are like this. I had a woman whose husband died. He was in hospice. He died. She was there in the house with him for a few hours. She called hospice. The nurse came and pronounced him dead. The mortuary came and took his body. And she just sat alone in her house for like 2 days before she called anybody. Finally, it came to my attention, and I went out to see her as a chaplain. And she's still like that. She's in my grief group. I know her well, and that's just who she is. But she's also having a very hard time. It's been about a year, and she hasn't moved his possessions or changed anything in the house. So, I could do a whole other presentation about complicated grief and prolonged mourning disorder. But that's topic for a whole other presentation.
Well, thank you. And we have another question sort of on the other end of the spectrum from Jimmy and Susan, which they ask how to deal with other family members or friends thinking that your grief and loss response of quote unquote happiness, relief, or connection is incorrect.
Yeah, well, those aren't the only responses they'll think is incorrect. Again, that is not what we would call a supportive community. And if you are around people who are dismissing your responses or telling you what they think you should be doing, and this is where the 5 stages come in, your friends and family will say, well, I never saw you go through the anger stage. What's wrong with you? You're suppressing your anger. Or I never saw you get depressed. What's wrong with you? Supposedly you're supposed to go through these 5 stages. You're going to get that kind of pressure a lot from people because everybody expects that. What can you do? You can't, send them all these research documents that I'm going to send to you and have them read it. The best thing you can do with somebody like that is send them to some websites, try to give them a little education to get them out of that box that they are expecting you to be in with them, and find some more supportive people. A lot of people don't know this, but any hospice in any town offers free grief support to the community. You do not have to be a hospice client. So you can just go on Google and find a hospice near you and tell them that you need some grief support, and they will put you into their grief group or make some referrals for you. So you can always find support. If you're not getting it at home, then go find it elsewhere. You got to look at this community we've had here this weekend. You are all connected to some sort of spiritual community or circle of friends that get you and will support you. And if you really, really don't have that, there are ways to find it. Simply just finding a grief support group in your community. What's really hard is, for younger people, it's so hard to find, my grief support group, the average age is probably 55. And if you've got teenage kids, your spouse dies or one of their friends dies, and, they're 15 or 19, they don't want to be in a group with a bunch of old people. We have in Portland a wonderful agency called the Dougie Center, which is just for young people. There's a great resource called thedinnerparty.org. Michael, if you could type that in, thedinnerparty.org. And that's for 20 to 40-year-olds. And it's an online resource. I recommend this to everybody for people that age. It's really hard. And then if you have younger kids, well, the Dougie Center is great for that. But kids, it depends, now we're getting into a conversation about the stages of cognitive development and how little kids perceive death versus 12-year-olds. That's, again, a topic for another discussion. But, adolescence is a really hard time. If you have like a 13-year-old boy, they're not really into hugging, so you have to reach out and find these resources. Okay, so I wanted to comment about the art comment. Thank you for that. In my presentation that I did here last year on rituals and ceremonies, we talked about creating art objects and symbolic representations. There's so much more I want to say here, but these are real, hands-on processes that you can do in the shamanic tradition, where you make a despacho. You just take a piece of paper like this, and you could write on it all the anger that you want to release, or a message to your loved one, whatever you want to do, and put some flower petals and some seeds and some things in it and wrap it up and put prayers in it, whatever you want to do, and just take whatever's inside you and put it outward into that little bundle, we call it in shamanism a despacho, and bury it in the earth and give those really strong, overwhelming feelings to something bigger than you, which is the earth. The earth, the rocks, you can throw it in a fire, you can throw it in a river. Those gigantic elements, earth and fire and water and air, can hold that big energy for you much better than your little frail human body can hold it. So these are processes like art that you can use to just release that. What we know about trauma is that trauma lives in the body. Trauma is a physiological condition more than a psychological condition. And so to heal, you want to release that from your body. And if you don't, what happens in the body is that it will fester. Okay, let me say this another way. Grief, I love using analogies of eating and digesting and metabolizing and releasing. So grief is just this big gnawing thing. It closes up your body like this, right? You feel it right here. It's in the heart chakra, and you close up and you wrap yourself around that vulnerable little heart to protect it, and you get very contracted. And the healing process is to open that up and be expansive instead of contracted. That's why we have grief yoga now, which is a beautiful practice. And that's why we want to do breath work. In the shamanic practices, we blow into rose petals, or we blow into rocks. I'm sort of repeating what I talked about last year to make the breath move. And so all these little processes are releasing the trauma from the body. If you hold it in there, if you stay like this, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to eat away at your bodily symptoms. So your grief has to be digested, just like food. If you eat a big chunk of really, if you eat like a giant piece of chocolate cake or something, or a big hunk of meat or something that doesn't digest easily, you can feel it's like just sitting there, right? It's not going through very well. Well, grief is like that too. You want it to digest, you want to metabolize it, and you want to release the waste products just like you do with food. The waste products of grief are guilt and shame and regret and blame and the stuff. And there are places for guilt. There's places for some of this, but you want it to be in the right place. And the stuff that isn't serving you, the stuff that isn't making you go toward restoration, that's the stuff you want to release. And you do this through these little art therapy and restoration processes. Someone's asking, how do you work with children? So I'm not a child specialist. And how do you explain? I can tell you how not to explain death to them. In fact, on my Ask Dr. Death podcast, if you go to askdrdeath.com, I just interviewed somebody about this very topic. She's a child life specialist, and she was talking about children's grief. The biggest mistake people make with children is using euphemisms. You never tell a child, grandma went to sleep and she never woke up, because what do you think the child's going to do?
Oh, they're going to think that's going to happen to them.
Right. They're not going to sleep. Right. And it happens all the time. It's so predictable. You also don't say grandma got sick and then she died, because the child, and kids get sick a lot when they're little, is going to be terrified of dying every time they get a runny nose. Or anytime anybody else gets sick, that they're going to think, oh, they're going to get sick and disappear like grandma did. You have to be really careful about your religious references. And, talking about toxic theology, a child who's raised in a family that talks to them about burning in hell. I have done art therapy groups with middle school kids and have listened to them talking to each other. And one of them said, my father was a junkie. He was in prison and he died. And, I think he's probably in hell. Isn't that why people go to hell? And the other kid, this was a great conversation. And the other kid said, nah, he's not in hell. God forgives everybody. Everybody gets to go to heaven. And so the other kid said, well, if that's true, then why is there a hell?
Great question.
It was so good. It was like the best theological answer in the world. So, you got to be really careful with stuff like that with kids. And to just like talking to kids about sex. And what do the experts tell us? You don't throw too much information at them. You answer their questions as they are asked. So a 5-year-old, if your mom is pregnant with a new baby and the 5-year-old says, how did the baby get in there? Which is exactly what they ask. You can tell them how the baby got in there, but don't tell them too much. And then they're going to go, oh, that's interesting. And they'll run off and play. And then they'll come back and they'll say, did you and daddy do that? And you'll say, yes, that's how we made you. And they'll go, oh, okay. And then they'll run off and play and forget about it. And a week later, they'll come back and ask another question. It's the same with death. You tell them exactly what they ask for, nothing more, nothing less. And you use the real words. You don't say, grandma went to heaven, or, grandma went to sleep. You just say that grandma died, or the cat died. And well, what is died? Well, died means that they're not in that body anymore. See, the cat's not breathing anymore. And you could say their spirit went somewhere else. Well, where did it go? Well, we don't really know where it went. But I actually had this conversation with a 4-year-old about a cat. I said, I don't know where your cat is right now, but I know that you can feel her. And if you just breathe right now really deep and think about how much you love your cat and just breathe and feel that love. Can you feel your cat? And she goes, yeah, I can feel her. And then she says, you mean my cat is air? And I'm like, yeah, that'll work, So, and that helped that kid a lot. Again, I don't work with kids a lot, so I don't have a lot of answers, but go to AskDrDeath.com and listen to the newest episode about children and grief.
I think I want to make sure that we get a sufficient break because this one's a shorter one. But I did want to ask Jimmy and Susan's question, which reminds me of the chair technique that that we were talking on before we went live.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you forgive someone who has passed if there's still beef against them, is the word that they use, still residing in you?
Mm-hmm. You just answered your own question. It has absolutely nothing to do with the other person. You do all that work 100% internally. It doesn't matter if they're dead or alive. That person that you're holding all that anger and lack of forgiveness could be sitting in your house in the next room right now. They don't have to be dead. And so that work is done on your own. And I have a little meditation for that called the forgiveness flyby. And you basically kind of go into a meditative state and imagine that person wherever they are, dead or alive. And you just let your soul fly over to them and hover around them, wherever you imagine them, sitting in a chair or whatever. And you say these words: I release you completely. I release you completely to your path. I release you. I release you. I release you. And then you fly back home into your own body. And that's the whole process. And in doing this, you know about the neuroplasticity of the brain, right? It's like when you stop smoking and you wear a rubber band on your wrist, and every time you want a cigarette, you snap the rubber band. And so your brain associates that desire for a cigarette with the pain of the rubber band on your wrist. This is the same idea. Forgiveness is a tricky word, so I suggest replacing the word forgive with release. Because all we're doing, it's not up to us to redeem another person for their deeds or to make it okay with them that they did whatever they did. It's all internal. So what we're really doing is releasing it from our body, just like with all the other trauma and all the other stuff. So you do that work internally. You do that meditation of, I release you to your path. The reason it's their path is because, they're a child abuser or a murderer or a terrible parent or whatever they are. That's what they're doing in this life. Let's not even go into why they're that way or judging them. That's their path right now. I release you to that. That's what you did to me. And I can't change that, but now I'm here with it and I'm going to release it. And I'm going to release my attachment to that trauma. I'm going to release my attachment to that experience so that I can move on and heal. And then you can do all these ritual processes. If you guys have access to the recording of my talk from last year, there's a whole lot of stuff about these processes, but same as what we said, blow into a rock, draw a picture, write a note, burn it in a fire, and just release, release, release. And you can say this forgiveness flyby 10 times a day if you want. Just you're driving your car, you're thinking about how angry you are at that person, and just say it out loud. I release you, I release you, I release you. These kinds of processes, science now knows, actually changes what happens in your brain. It actually can change the neural pathways of trauma you can teach your brain to function differently. This is not my field of expertise, so I can't speak on it very well, but read anything that you can about trauma and neuroplasticity. In fact, the best book in the whole world, I'm going to type it in here, is The Body Keeps the Score by, give me a minute to type here because I can't type and talk at the same time, by Bessel van der Kolk. He is the leading. Sure. Yeah, he is the guy. Read that book. It will tell you everything about how to do this.
It's actually Van der Kolk.
Van der.
And he's taught at Menla. Yeah, he's a wonderful man. He's done great work in the field. Well, Terry, I love the way that you talk about such a difficult subject and the words that you give to it to give it shape and to give meaning, actually, to one of the more difficult things that people ever have to face in life. So I'm very grateful that you came here today again to share your wisdom and experience with us. Terry kindly made herself available. If you have questions after the conference at her email. And I hope the talk was very helpful for everyone. Now we're going to take a short break and we'll reconvene at 4 p.m. Eastern when we'll be joined by Richard Martini. So thanks again, Terry, and thanks to everyone for being here.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
And have a great day.